at a moment when King Charles was receiving standing ovations during his triumphant tour of the United States. Back home in Britain, the institution he now leads was quietly bracing for a storm that has been building for decades. Three separate but deeply interconnected crises were colliding in the same news cycle. The mysterious disappearance of Sarah Ferguson from public life, raising urgent questions about what she knows and what she might be willing to say. A landmark intervention by former Prime Minister Gordon Brown in the pages of the New Statesman, presenting forensic new evidence about Prince Andrew and his connections to the convicted sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein, and a growing bipartisan demand from parliamentarians, journalists and victims' advocates that the British state will answer for what many investigators believe was a systematic and deliberate cover-up spanning 4 decades. Together, these developments represent perhaps the most serious constitutional and moral reckoning the modern British monarchy has ever faced. And yet, as events of the past week have made clear, the machinery of denial, delay, and institutional self-protection remains extraordinarily powerful. Few figures in the orbit of the British royal family have proven as difficult to read or as difficult to contain as Sarah Ferguson, the former wife of Prince Andrew, Duke of York. In recent weeks, she has become the subject of what observers have taken to calling a real-world game of luxury hide-and-seek, one in which the stakes are anything but trivial. Sources close to the investigation into Andrew's conduct confirm that there is deep and growing anxiety within palace circles about what the Duchess of York might know, and more critically, what she might eventually decide to reveal. Sightings of Ferguson have been reported across a remarkable geography. A Swiss sanatorium was the first location to emerge through journalistic contacts in Switzerland. Then came reports of an Austrian spa resort, followed by unconfirmed sightings in Donegal on the northwest coast of Ireland, and even a report placing her before Christmas at a roadside service station on the M6 motorway in northern England. None of these accounts has been fully verified, which itself tells a story. A woman of such public prominence, with such a long and complicated relationship with both the press and the palace, does not simply vanish without intent. The question investigators and journalists are now asking is not merely where she is, but why she is there and who is paying for it. The financial dimension of Ferguson's movements deserves particular scrutiny. Her history with money has been nothing short of turbulent. She accumulated debts running into millions of pounds over the course of her post-divorce life, a pattern that made her reliant on a rotating cast of wealthy benefactors, former romantic partners and business associates of varying degrees of respectability. Among those names that have circulated in investigative circles are Count Gaddo della Gherardesca, an Italian aristocrat, and Paddy McNally, the former Formula One paddock impresario who was once widely expected to marry her. Whether either of these figures is currently providing Ferguson with accommodation is unknown. What is not unknown, however, is the pattern. She has historically found ways to parlay her royal connections into material support, and the suggestion that she may currently be receiving complimentary stays at luxury European health resorts in exchange for the publicity those establishments receive is entirely consistent with her documented approach to financial survival. The reappearance of Ferguson in photographic form, published in the Sun newspaper, provided its own set of clues about her strategy. The photographer who captured the images is not an unknown quantity. He is what Fleet Street veterans describe as a tame photographer, an image maker with an established and mutually beneficial relationship with his subject. The Sun has historically been one of Ferguson's most reliable outlets, a newspaper with which she has maintained a calculated closeness over many years. The combination of a sympathetic photographer and a sympathetic publication strongly suggests that the images were not the product of an accidental encounter. Investigators and media analysts who have examined the circumstances believe this was almost certainly a managed disclosure, a deliberate decision to re-enter the public conversation on her own terms, rather than having the story break in a more damaging way through a less cooperative outlet. Crucially, the accompanying framing of the story was revealing. The briefing to The Sun, as sources familiar with the arrangement have described it, carried a specific and unmistakable message. Ferguson, it was implied, was worried about becoming homeless. She was financially vulnerable. and she possessed information about the royal family that could, if she chose to deploy it, cause considerable damage. Specifically, the suggestion was floated that she was considering a documentary deal worth approximately £1.3 million. This is not the language of a woman in retreat. This is the language of negotiation. Informed observers of the royal family read the signals clearly. Ferguson was issuing a warning to Buckingham Palace and to Kensington Palace that she had not yet played all of her cards. The question of what cards she actually holds is one that makes palace officials deeply uncomfortable. Ferguson was married to Andrew for 10 years and has maintained a close personal relationship with him and with his circle ever since their divorce in 1996. She was, by multiple accounts, close to the late Diana, Princess of Wales, and through that friendship, likely absorbed a considerable quantity of sensitive information about the royal family more broadly, including about the now King Charles. She was present, at least on the periphery, during the years in which Andrew built and maintained his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. She reportedly wrote to Epstein on one occasion, and the contents of that letter, which have since become public, are extraordinarily damaging in their own right. The letter spoke of her love and gratitude and referred to Epstein as a legend, describing herself as being at his service and even, in language that reads as playful but is politically devastating, suggesting he should marry her. For a woman hoping to rehabilitate her public image, this is not a document she can easily disown. There is a school of thought within the palace, and among those who have studied the Ferguson phenomenon closely, that the best approach would be a clean break. Allow her to go public, absorb the inevitable media storm, and then move on. After all, the argument goes, the royal family survived Harry and Meghan. The Oprah interview in March 2021 was widely described at the time as an existential threat to the monarchy. It generated global headlines and brought accusations of institutional racism to the steps of Buckingham Palace. And yet, within 18 months, polling showed that the royal family had largely recovered its standing among the British public, while Harry and Meghan's own popularity in Britain had collapsed to historic lows. The case for the publish and be damned approach is therefore not without historical precedent. But the counter-argument, and it is a serious one, is that Ferguson is not Harry. She does not merely have personal grievances about how she was treated. She may have documentary evidence. She may have specific knowledge of financial arrangements that would not simply be a source of embarrassment but of legal jeopardy. It is the financial dimension, far more than any romantic or personal scandal, that is said to be the primary source of anxiety at the highest levels of the institution. And in that respect, the most explosive claim buried within Gordon Brown's New Statesman investigation has received far less attention than it deserves. The allegation that Ferguson stood to benefit from an oil deal in Nigeria worth approximately $6 million. That a former senior member of the royal family was allegedly positioned to receive that level of financial benefit from a commercial arrangement in a foreign country is a story of profound public interest, and the fact that it has not become a dominant headline in the major broadcast networks says something troubling about the appetite of parts of the British media establishment for this particular line of inquiry. There remains, throughout all of this, the question of the daughters. Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie are the clearest and most visible reminder that the York scandal has not been neatly contained. A recent photograph of Eugenie at a social gathering in Sicily attracted considerable attention, partly because of what it visually communicated, that the daughters of Prince Andrew continue to live lives of conspicuous privilege, attending glamorous European events while their father remains confined under what amounts to a form of informal house arrest at Sandringham. Every such image reopens the wound. It reminds the public that the consequences of the Epstein affair have not fallen equally on everyone connected to it, and within palace circles, where the future of the York daughters' titles and their public roles remains as a subject of active and unresolved debate, the sight of them living apparently unaffected lives abroad is understood to be a constant pressure on those making decisions about how far to push the family into the shadows. The intervention of Gordon Brown into the Epstein story represents a qualitative shift in the political dynamics surrounding this scandal. Brown is not a tabloid journalist working sources in nightclubs. He is not a political opponent settling scores. He is a former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, a man with deep institutional knowledge, a reputation for forensic attention to detail, and a moral seriousness rooted, by his own account, in a Presbyterian upbringing as the son of a Church of Scotland minister. His wife, Sarah Brown, has been prominently involved in charitable work connected to victims of abuse, and those who know the couple well believe her engagement with that cause has played a role in bringing this issue to the former Prime Minister's sustained attention. When a man of that calibre puts his name to a lengthy, granular, legally scrutinised investigation in a serious political magazine and calls for a parliamentary inquiry, the political temperature rises in ways that cannot simply be managed with a palace press release. Brown's article in the New Statesman was not a column. It was a brief, running to 5 or 6 dense pages. It presented specific dates, specific names, specific transactions, and specific failures of oversight, drawing on Brown's personal experience in government as well as extensive investigative research. The piece had clearly been examined line by the magazine's legal team, which means that everything it asserts has been judged defensible in a court of law. That is not a trivial standard to meet, and the fact that it was met speaks to the quality and specificity of what Brown was able to put on the record. Among the most striking revelations was a disclosure drawn directly from Brown's own experience as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Brown described Andrew approaching him with a proposal for a dedicated Royal Air Fleet, a private aviation arrangement that would give the royal family exclusive and independent access to aircraft without depending on commercial or RAF provision. This alone would have been a remarkable request, one that speaks to Andrew's instinct for self-enrichment and his casual assumption that the resources of the British state were his to deploy. But Brown went further, describing how Andrew, in pursuing this scheme, had approached David Rowland, a controversial financier with his own complex history, regarding the use of Rowland's aircraft, which Andrew had helped him purchase from the Canadian aerospace company Bombardier. Andrew then used this aircraft at a cost of £7,600 per hour without declaring the arrangement. This is not a minor oversight. It is a potential serious breach of public accountability rules, and it is characteristic of a pattern of behaviour that stretched across the entirety of Andrew's decade-long tenure as Special Representative for International Trade and Investment. Those familiar with the mechanics of major arms and aviation deals in the Gulf states and elsewhere will recognise in this account a familiar template. In the commercial cultures of several countries where Andrew operated, significant financial transactions routinely involve what are euphemistically described as facilitation payments and what are legally defined as bribes. Andrew's contempt for the anti-corruption frameworks that governed British commercial diplomacy was not a secret within Whitehall. He reportedly made remarks to the Serious Fraud Office that were dismissive of legal prohibitions on bribery, suggesting that business simply could not be done if such constraints were applied. He made similar sentiments known publicly at a dinner that became notorious for the embarrassment it caused the British government. It is therefore not unreasonable, given this documented mindset, to speculate that Andrew's enthusiastic involvement in facilitating the Rowland aircraft purchase was motivated by more than public service. Proving it, however, is another matter entirely. Financial transfers of the kind that might constitute a kickback in this context are typically structured through offshore accounts, through gift registries, through jewellery presented to family members, through mechanisms deliberately designed to prevent tracing. The Royal Gift Register, which is meant to provide transparency about presents received by members of the royal family from foreign governments and other sources, is, according to those who have studied it, very far from complete. Investigators have noted instances where royal family members declared gifts from countries they had visited, only for those visits to be absent from the court circular entirely, suggesting a deliberate effort to limit the documentary trail of certain engagements. Brown's investigation also addressed a dimension of the story that has received insufficient attention in broadcast media: the question of the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, the formal mechanism through which the British government could have cooperated with American prosecutors investigating Epstein and his associates. Brown's investigation implies strongly that the decision not to cooperate under this treaty was not a bureaucratic failure but a political one, and that it reached all the way to the office of the then Home Secretary Priti Patel. Jeffrey Berman, the former United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, who was leading the prosecution, has stated on the record that requests for cooperation from British authorities met with resistance that was unusual and not easily explained by standard procedural considerations. That resistance, if it was indeed politically directed from the level of a cabinet minister, represents an abuse of public office of the most serious kind, and it demands a public accounting that has not yet been provided. The other side of this equation involves the Americans themselves. Mark Rowley, the current Metropolitan Police Commissioner, has reportedly sought unredacted material from United States authorities to assist the ongoing British investigation into Andrew. He has not received it. The two sides appear to be locked in what one source has described as a game of mutual obstruction, each waiting for the other to move first, while the investigation stalls and the clock ticks. The Epstein files released by American courts have been, according to those who have scrutinized them, substantially incomplete. There is a strong and growing suspicion among investigators on both sides of the Atlantic that the redactions protect not only private individuals but also political figures of very significant standing in multiple countries. The question of whether Tony Blair, who met Epstein at Downing Street on the recommendation of Peter Mandelson, and who Epstein reportedly described as someone he knew well, is among those being protected by incomplete disclosure, is one that informed observers are beginning to ask with increasing directness. One of the most illuminating and least reported aspects of the investigation has been the systematic stonewalling of freedom of information requests submitted by journalists and researchers seeking basic factual information about Andrew's official activities. The scale and creativity of the refusals have been remarkable. Requests seeking straightforward information about Andrew's travel and accommodation arrangements during official trips have been rejected on grounds that defy common sense. Health and safety was cited as a reason for refusal in relation to a question about a visit to Azerbaijan that took place at least 15 years ago. The notion that disclosing the logistical details of a decade-and-a-half-old foreign visit could constitute a health and safety risk to any living person requires a considerable leap of imagination. National security was invoked repeatedly, even in relation to visits classified as private rather than official. The cost compliance threshold, the limit beyond which a public authority is not required to respond, was applied with what critics describe as strategic generosity, calibrated to prevent rather than facilitate legitimate inquiry. Investigators who submitted 5 years' worth of requests, literally hundreds of individual submissions, found that the initial decision to refuse was almost never overturned on internal review. The external oversight body, the Information Commissioner, has in recent years become increasingly sympathetic to the positions taken by public authorities. The first-tier tribunal, the final domestic avenue of appeal, is populated by judges who, according to multiple experienced information rights practitioners, are inclined to take what one source described as the safest possible line, meaning the line least likely to embarrass those in power. This is not a matter of bureaucratic caution. Freedom of information law exists precisely to make public bodies accountable to the citizens they serve. The exemptions it contains are meant to be applied narrowly and in good faith. When they are applied broadly and in apparent bad faith, as the pattern of refusals in the Andrew investigation strongly suggests, the effect is not merely to delay access to specific pieces of information. The effect is to undermine the principle of democratic accountability itself. Tony Blair, who as Prime Minister introduced the Freedom of Information Act, later described it as his greatest political regret. That remark has acquired a new and deeply uncomfortable resonance in the context of this investigation. Requests put forward by respected senior parliamentarians, including questions submitted by Baroness Boycott, the former editor of The Independent, and by Lord Foulkes, a former Leslie minister, received responses that were either non-existent or so vague as to be meaningless. If figures of that standing cannot extract basic information from the British state about the official activities of a serving royal, the prospects for ordinary citizens and independent journalists are considerably bleaker. The call for a parliamentary inquiry, which has now been joined by Gordon Brown with the full weight of his political authority, is therefore not merely about Prince Andrew. It is about whether the British state is capable of holding itself to account. Central to Gordon Brown's investigation is a detailed examination of the mechanisms by which Jeffrey Epstein and his associates were able to use Britain as what one source has called a private playground, despite Epstein being a convicted sex offender whose conviction should have appeared on any visa application he made to enter the United Kingdom. The aviation dimension of this story is particularly significant. Private jets, especially those that declare themselves to be in transit to a third destination, are subject to substantially fewer customs and immigration checks than commercial aircraft. Investigators who have examined Epstein's travel records found a recurring pattern. Flights would arrive at British airports declaring an onward destination, only for the tickets for that second leg of the journey to be subsequently cancelled and refunds obtained through credit card companies including American Express. The passengers, many of them young women travelling on under 25 ticket rates, would then remain in the country without having been subjected to proper border checks. This pattern was repeated across multiple visits spanning more than a decade. The airports used were not only major civilian hubs. Brown's investigation highlights the use of Royal Air Force bases, including RAF Marham, which raises questions about the level of official authorization that would have been required for those flights to land at military facilities, and who gave it. What makes this especially disturbing is the legislative context. In 2015, Theresa May, in one of the most significant acts of her tenure as Home Secretary, introduced the Modern Slavery Act, which explicitly criminalized sex trafficking and created new obligations on both public and private bodies to identify and respond to indicators of exploitation. By any reasonable application of that law, the movement of large numbers of young women on private jets that were ostensibly in transit, but that consistently terminated at their British destinations, with the travel and accommodation of those passengers apparently arranged and funded by a convicted sex offender, should have triggered exactly the kind of scrutiny the legislation was designed to require. It did not. The question of why it did not, and who made the decision or series of decisions that allowed the arrangement to continue undisturbed, has not yet been answered. The same principle of systemic failure applies to the financial side of the story. The sale of Andrew's former home, Sunninghill Park, to a Kazakh businessman for a price substantially above its market valuation attracted considerable controversy and has been investigated repeatedly by journalists and documentary makers. Evidence emerged suggesting that the financial arrangements were structured through offshore trusts in ways that should have triggered anti-money laundering checks. Those checks do not appear to have been conducted, or if they were, the results were not acted upon. The pattern that emerges from all of these individual failures is not that of an institution making occasional mistakes. It is the pattern of an institution that has learned over many decades that the rules applied to everyone else can be applied very differently when the subjects of scrutiny are sufficiently powerful. The arrest of Prince Andrew in January of this year was interpreted by different observers in very different ways. Those inclined toward optimism about the prospects of justice saw it as a decisive moment, a sign that the Metropolitan Police were genuinely prepared to pursue a prosecution regardless of the political consequences. Those with longer memories and greater cynicism read it differently, as a necessary response to intense public pressure combined with practical motivations that had little to do with the ultimate goal of bringing charges. The assessment of those who have studied the case most closely is that the arrest was primarily motivated by concerns about flight risk. Andrew's movements in the weeks preceding the arrest, combined with the removal of large quantities of documents and materials from Royal Lodge in Windsor, had created significant anxiety among investigators that evidence was being destroyed, and that the Duke himself might seek refuge in a jurisdiction from which extradition would be difficult or impossible. Multiple sources have reported that materials were being removed from Royal Lodge and incinerated from early December onwards. The arrest provided legal authority to search both Royal Lodge and a storage facility in central London, where some of those materials appear to have been transferred. It was, in this reading, an investigative tool as much as a statement of prosecutorial intent. Whether charges will ultimately follow is a question on which informed opinion is deeply divided, though the balance of expert assessment leans toward pessimism. A former senior police officer who has spoken about the case has suggested that the most likely mechanism by which any prosecution would be derailed is Andrew's ability to compel his brother, King Charles, to give evidence in his defense. A trial in which the reigning monarch is called as a witness would create an unprecedented constitutional crisis, one that neither the courts nor the government would be eager to navigate. The royal family has a long and well-documented history of intervening at precisely the moment when a legal proceeding threatens to expose uncomfortable truths. The case of Paul Burrell, the former butler to Princess Diana, who was dramatically acquitted in 2002 after the Queen suddenly recalled a conversation that undermined the prosecution's case, is the most vivid example of this pattern, though far from the only one. In that episode, as in many others, the instinct of the institution to protect itself from public scrutiny overrode every other consideration. There is also the matter of the evidence held by American authorities. Sources within the FBI have indicated that material relating to Andrew was passed to British investigators in 2022, around the time that Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted in New York. That material, by multiple accounts, was not acted upon. One explanation offered is that the evidential standards required by British courts differ sufficiently from those applied by American prosecutors that the package required significant additional work before it could support a British prosecution. A more troubling explanation, and one that cannot be ruled out, is that it was simply set aside. If the latter is the case, the better prospect for accountability may lie not in British courts but in American ones. Many of the alleged offences occurred on American soil in Manhattan, in Palm Beach, and in the British Virgin Islands. American jurisdictions exists. American prosecutors have shown, at least in the Maxwell case, a willingness to pursue powerful individuals regardless of their social standing. Whether that willingness extends to a member of the British royal family remains to be seen, but it is a prospect that those close to the investigation are following with close attention. One of the most striking features of the landscape that surrounds this scandal is the extraordinary reticence of the political figures who were most directly involved in overseeing Andrew's activities during the years when those activities were allegedly at their most problematic. Former foreign secretaries who would ordinarily have no hesitation in offering their opinions on events of public importance have gone silent on this subject. Former ministers of state who dealt directly with Andrew in his capacity as trade envoy have declined interview requests. Former ambassadors who were, by multiple accounts, placed under direct pressure to facilitate meetings between Andrew and individuals of dubious character have proved impossible to engage. Among those whose silence has been noticed is Chris Bryant, who served as a minister in the Foreign Office and has previously been vocal on a wide range of political and ethical questions. Jack Straw, the former Foreign Secretary whose period in office overlapped significantly with Andrew's most active years as trade envoy, spoke briefly to investigators but offered very little given the documented extent of his interactions with the Duke. William Hague, another former Foreign Secretary, cited his current advisory role to the Prince and Princess of Wales as a reason he could not comment. Alan Duncan, Hugo Swire, and other former Foreign Office ministers who dealt with Andrew are believed to have considerable relevant knowledge. None has spoken publicly in any detail. The silence of these figures, as Gordon Brown's intervention has implicitly underscored, is itself a form of historical record. It tells us something about the culture of deference and self-protection that has surrounded the Crown for generations, a culture in which the knowledge that speaking out might implicate oneself in the same networks one is being asked to describe provides a powerful incentive for continued silence. Investigators who have pursued this story over many years have noted repeatedly that a large number of people, ambassadors, civil servants, business associates, and personal friends, knew that Andrew's behaviour was wrong, and yet either felt too exposed themselves, or too frightened, or bound by too strong a sense of institutional loyalty, to say anything. The result is a conspiracy of silence that has protected a pattern of alleged wrongdoing across 4 decades and multiple governments of both major parties. The pattern extends beyond elected politicians to the civil service and the diplomatic corps. Senior officials who received and processed freedom of information requests that were refused on grounds that do not withstand scrutiny remain anonymous behind the generic email addresses through which those refusals were communicated. The question of who precisely is making these decisions and on whose authority has not been answered. In a functioning democracy, these are questions to which citizens are entitled to answers. The fact that they are not receiving them is a measure of how far the norms of democratic accountability have been eroded in this particular domain. And the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has said remarkably little about a matter that touches on some of the most serious allegations ever made against a member of the British royal family. His defenders argue that ongoing police investigations should not be prejudiced by political commentary, and that is a defensible position in narrow legal terms. But it does not address the broader obligation of a head of government to speak clearly about the principles that underpin a democratic society. Victims of the abuse that Epstein facilitated, and the advocates who speak on their behalf, expected more from a Prime Minister who built his career on the rule of law. Perhaps the most structurally significant question raised by the events of the past several weeks concerns the role of the British intelligence and security services in either enabling or suppressing the investigation into Andrew and his associates. The circumstances surrounding Peter Mandelson's appointment as Britain's ambassador to the United States brought this question into sharp focus. It emerged that Mandelson had failed vetting. The Prime Minister was reportedly not informed of this failure. The Foreign Secretary was not informed. The Home Secretary was not informed. The decision to proceed with the appointment, despite the vetting failure, was taken by persons who have not been publicly identified, on grounds that have not been publicly explained. This sequence of events has caused serious analysts to ask whether there exists within the British state a level of decision-making that operates outside the normal channels of democratic accountability, a network of unidentified individuals whose judgments override those of elected ministers, without those ministers being aware that any such override has occurred. Sources with knowledge of how the intelligence services have approached the Andrew investigation offer a somewhat more measured interpretation. Their account is that the relevant agencies did, over the course of many years, accumulate information about Andrew's activities and associations that was troubling, and that this information was passed, through appropriate channels, to government and to the palace. It was ignored. The intelligence services, in this account, did not protect Andrew. They warned about him. The failure was not one of intelligence collection, but of political will. What is now acknowledged among those who follow this story most closely is that Andrew's social and professional circle included individuals who were, or are suspected of being, intelligence assets of hostile foreign powers. Yang Tengbo, the individual accused of being a Chinese intelligence officer, was an associate of Andrew's. The legal proceeding that incorporated this dimension collapsed under circumstances that have not been fully explained, and there is a suspicion among investigators that Andrew's connection to the case played a role in its outcome. Russia-adjacent figures, individuals with documented connections to the Russian state or to Russian intelligence networks, were also present in Andrew's orbit during his years as trade envoy. These threads have not been fully pursued in public reporting, but they represent a dimension of the scandal that goes considerably beyond questions of personal morality or financial impropriety. They go to the heart of British national security, and they represent, as one senior political commentator has written, the area where the story is most likely to develop next. Against this backdrop of investigation, evasion, and institutional self-protection, the British public continues to display what can only be described as a remarkable capacity for absorbing scandal without demanding fundamental change. The King's tour of the United States was, by any measure, a triumph of soft power. He was received with warmth and evident affection, and polling consistently shows that, despite everything, despite the Epstein connection, despite the Sussex revelations, despite the ongoing controversy over Andrew, the monarchy as an institution retains the support of a majority of the British population. This resilience is not entirely mysterious. Royal scandals have a long history in Britain, and they have consistently proven to be more durable as entertainment than as catalysts for constitutional reform. A researcher going through 40 years of press cuttings recently noted with some astonishment that there were, in those archives, a substantial number of stories that had been genuinely damaging to individual members of the royal family at the time of their publication, stories involving financial misconduct, personal impropriety, and breaches of public trust that had now been entirely forgotten by the general public. The media ecosystem in which those stories lived was, and to a significant extent remains, one in which royal scandal is treated as a form of drama rather than a matter of civic accountability. Things get thrown at the institution with considerable force, and then, like a Teflon surface, they fail to stick. The appointment of Anna Kie as the official biographer of the late Queen Elizabeth II illustrates the structural limitations of this arrangement. Kie is a respected historian, but her specialism is the 17th century Civil War period, not modern political history. More significantly, the papers she will have access to have been pre-selected not by an independent archivist applying professional standards of completeness and impartiality, but by Paul Wybrew, the Queen's former personal attendant. Wybrew's loyalty is to the institution, not to historical truth. The result is that the official account of Elizabeth's reign will be shaped by someone whose fundamental interest lies in the protection of the Crown's reputation. This is not how democratic societies in the 21st century should be managing the public record of their institutions. As critics have observed, this approach is more consistent with the practices of 19th century imperial courts than with the expectations of a modern open society. The contrast with what a genuine commitment to transparency would look like is stark. Making the primary sources available simultaneously to all researchers, allowing historians of different perspectives and specializations to draw their own conclusions and publish their own accounts, would represent a meaningful step toward the kind of accountability that this moment demands. Instead, the institution has chosen the authorized version, and the authorized version will, predictably, authorize the institution. The path from where we are now to anything that might reasonably be called accountability is long, uncertain, and obstructed at almost every point by the combined weight of institutional inertia, political cowardice, and the structural advantages that wealth and status confer in every jurisdiction on earth. Those who have spent years pursuing this story are not naive about the odds they face. The British state has, as one investigator observed, centuries of accumulated expertise in keeping things under wraps. The Profumo affair of 1963, one of the defining political scandals of the 20th century, is still not fully documented in the public record. Files remain closed. The principles are long dead, but the institutions that protected them continue to function on the same reflex of self-preservation. Hillsborough took decades to reach anything approaching justice. Countless other cover-ups have simply succeeded, fading from public consciousness before accountability could catch up. And yet the landscape is not entirely without hope. Gordon Brown's intervention has changed the political calculus in ways that are difficult to fully predict. A former Prime Minister who puts his name to a detailed and legally scrutinized investigation is not easily dismissed. The calls for a parliamentary inquiry are gaining momentum across party lines. The victims of Epstein's trafficking network, many of whom are still alive and still seeking acknowledgement of what was done to them and why it was allowed to continue for so long, have powerful advocates who are not going to go away. And the public, while it may be forgiving by habit, is not infinitely patient. There is a level of documented wrongdoing, combined with a sufficiently visible pattern of attempted concealment, beyond which even the most institution-loyal population begins to demand something more than platitudes and managed disclosures. A parliamentary inquiry, if established with genuine powers of compulsion and genuine independence from both the government and the palace, could force testimony from individuals who have refused to speak voluntarily. A real reform of the freedom of information regime, closing the loopholes that have been exploited to prevent legitimate inquiries, would make it harder for the British state to repeat the pattern of evasion that has characterized its response to this story. And a serious and visible commitment from both the Metropolitan Police and the Crown Prosecution Service to pursue the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of where that leads, would send a signal to the international partners whose cooperation the British investigation needs but has not yet fully obtained. Sarah Ferguson knows something. Gordon Brown has documented a great deal. The victims know everything that was done to them. The files exist. The evidence exists. The question that this moment in British history is asking, with a directness that previous generations managed to avoid, is whether the institutions that are supposed to deliver justice are capable of overcoming their own deepest instincts and actually doing so. It is a question that goes far beyond one disgraced prince, far beyond one compromised duchess, and far beyond one notorious trafficker who died in an American jail cell. It goes to the credibility of the British state itself, and the answer, when it finally comes, will define what kind of democracy Britain actually is.